Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the final Google Hangout. This week we're going to be talking about global Englishes, and we're going to be talking about some of the comments and questions you've made this week, so thank you very much for those. They've been very interesting and very useful. We're also a bit later going to talk about the 2 polls that you've been completing as well, and the results from those will be published later today. Today I am joined by Dr. Rob Baird and Dr. Mariko Kitazawa, who are colleagues of mine at the Centre for Global Englishes. We were also hoping to have a special guest appearance from Professor Jennifer Jenkins, who's the director of the Centre for Global Englishes. Unfortunately, she's unwell today, so she sends her apologies and her best wishes. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Rob now, who's going to go through some of your first questions.
Okay, thank you, Will. Okay, hello everybody. So yes, I'd first of all like to address a question that came up about testing, and a lot of people were pointing out the nature of English and how it relates to or what choices teachers have when they're doing language testing. So an initial point with English as a lingua franca and global Englishes is related to the washback effect of tests. So lots of people pointed out that maybe they appreciate the flexibility of language. They appreciate the idea that, communicative competence is important and is not always achieved by corrections. However, lots of people who are English teachers at the moment are experiencing this point that actually they have to teach according to set syllabi. They have to teach what they are told to teach, and if they teach this communicative competence, this flexibility of language, perhaps their students will be disadvantaged. And of course, an important point was raised that English as a lingua franca is a descriptive research project. It's describing how people use language. And again, how people use language is quite flexible. How we assess language traditionally has not been very flexible. And actually some people are arguing, for example, McNamara recently made a strong argument that technology and measurements are actually becoming less flexible in relation to language tests. So we test English in a way that's more amenable to testing a set model, testing grammar. So again, it's quite interesting that this problem came up. And again, it's a real life problem, and really we can't offer many solutions because people are in their own contexts. But I mean, I used to be an IELTS examiner of speaking, writing, and the other skills. And yes, you do find these issues coming up, and you do find, for example, people being marked wrong for saying South China instead of Southern China in an answer. You do find on the marking criteria that it's okay in IELTS Band 9 to have, to make mistakes that native speakers commonly make, but not mistakes that non-native speakers commonly make. And as we see from the English as a lingua franca data, and intercultural communication research in general does show that actually, these are not necessarily mistakes. You don't describe language in terms of mistakes. So we find a sort of an ideological approach to language testing where there's a perception that there is a right and a wrong. And again, areas of grammar where there's a grey area, generally language assessments don't like it. So yeah, this was perceived as having a washback effect for the classroom. And again, the way lots of people are approaching this in research is to produce, or to try to produce tests that emphasize communicative competence, that say actually there are lots of strategies, making things clear. So like black color makes it clearer what you're talking about. Graveness makes it clear that you're talking about a noun, and it lowers the mental processing during communication, which makes the communication more fluid, more fluent. And actually these are positive, but they're traditionally marked down. So that people are exploring ways of testing performance and being appreciative of the complexity of language. However, IELTS, IB, TOEFL, and lots of other assessments, the Pearson test, which marks writing by machine, these are seen to be directions where actually lots of teachers just face a situation where they don't know what to do. Maybe their values with language are quite different from what they have to prepare students for. So again, raising awareness of elements of language is important. Okay, so that's my rough answer to the questions that came up about testing, but if you have more questions, please do ask. And now I'll hand over to Mariko, who has another answer for you, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I've got a question about something in relation to my video in which I just explained the historical spread of English. And some people have pointed out that I haven't really mentioned the one factor, which is English is easier than other languages to learn, which is why it had spread. And I am aware that this is not that uncommon view. I have seen something very similar before, and loads of people have mentioned, for example, English does not have grammatical gender like the German language, French language, so that's why it's easier for people to learn. I'm not very sure about this, and actually we have gotten a comment, and Fiona, for example, said she thought English is actually a difficult language to learn because there are lots of irregular verbs and spelling is in a sense strange, for example. And in a sense, I think both are right in terms of the description of some aspects of this language and the effects of these language aspects have for language learning. So yes, it's probably true that some aspects of English language learning is a little easier than other languages, for example, because it doesn't have grammatical gender. And yes, probably some aspects of that English might be difficult for learners to acquire compared to other languages. And it is, I think, very difficult to say which language is easier than others. Firstly, because language is such a complex system with so many aspects interrelated, so we can't really say overall this is easier than this one. And secondly, because the easiness or difficulty of language learning largely depends on the learner's first languages, of course. So, for example, my first language is Japanese, and I don't think English is one of the easiest languages for Japanese people to learn. You know, word order is different, pronunciation system is completely different, and then obviously written systems, written forms are different. So it's very difficult to kind of give an answer, general answer, yes, English has spread because it's one of the easiest languages to learn. So my answer to that question is I can't say that it is, yes, but I can't say that it's the easiest language to learn. So yes, I'm going to hand over to Will now, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Rob and Mariko, for those responses. Yeah, I mean, something I was going to add to Mariko's point is, or a related point rather, is people have asked, is some kind of global form of English going to emerge? So a sort of simplified form of English. If we're all using English for intercultural communication, will we, you know, Mariko's just explained very clearly that English is not more simple or more difficult than other languages, that languages are perhaps more complex than that. But I think people often wonder if this global use of a language will result in a shared, simplified form of English. Now, I think this is problematic for a number of reasons. Of course, we do share English as a global language, but actually what English we share as a global language is far from certain and far from established. Empirical research has shown a great deal of variation, and actually this even questions what we mean when we say English. There is so much variation there. And secondly, I think also one of the reasons that a language, and doesn't just have to be English, but happens to be English in this case, one of the reasons that a language functions so well as a global lingua franca is that it is adaptable. If you have a fixed form of the language and it's a very rigid structure to it, then it's not going to be adaptable for all the different contexts, all the different purposes, all the different people who are going to use it. So flexibility, adaptation and change, I think, are an inherent part of any language that's going to be used as a global international language. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is pass back to Rob, who's going to address another one of the questions for today, and then he'll hand over in turn back to Mariko. Okay, Rob.
Thank you, Will. Okay. So yeah, related to that, actually, I thought I would take up a question that came up, and I'd call this primary research in a sense, where somebody mentioned what they'd just done in their class before. This was from Nick, who asked, okay, one of his students in his class used the word youngness. Should he let it pass as a legitimate use of English, or should he correct it and teach the student the word youth? So this relates to lots of questions that came up about language teaching and English as a lingua franca. So thank you, Nick, for that research that you're adding into the English as a lingua franca area. So yeah, I actually wanted to discuss this around the area. And again, it links back to what Will said about the feature of intercultural communication, the feature of English as a lingua franca, which is this fluidity and adaptability. So people have the idea we are speaking English, but with this English there comes a lot of potential. So the speaker has a meaning which has to be understood also by the listener. And negotiating that situation is a skill in itself. So in a way, I'd say that this use of youngness is actually adapting the language. Perhaps they don't know the word youth, or perhaps the word youth, by its definition, is not in their first language exactly what they wanted to say. So the definition of youth is perhaps not what they wanted. So, you know, the language comes with a framework. So perhaps they didn't want to be inside the framework. Perhaps they're compensating for not knowing the word that was necessary. Perhaps you might use that language to help somebody understand who doesn't know, or who might not know the word youth. So in a way, I'd say youngness is an example of a skilled communicator. Or there are lots of situations where using that word would be an important skill in an intercultural communication setting using English. However, the point was raised conversely that maybe if the meaning is youth and youngness is a more ambiguous word, so maybe people don't know exactly how old, like youngness could be 1 year old, could be 15 years old perhaps. So again, there's that question, and I'd say that relates again to what we were saying with testing, that I think it's important to raise awareness among learners of the variability of language, that there are words that are out there that have this understood meaning, that are in dictionaries, but at the same time they have to be prepared to negotiate this meaning in particular context. So if you want to raise people's communicative competence in the classroom, then I think there has to be a degree of flexibility, but there also has to be a degree of reflection where you raise students' awareness about what they produced, what they said, how they created nouns, what possibilities are there, checking with the other students how well they understood, how well they would have understood with a different word. And again, I think this is a negotiated way, but of course, your own classrooms, if you are language teachers, your own classrooms will be different places. Everybody teaches language in a context. So some things that are appropriate in some places are not appropriate in others. But yeah, I'd certainly say that allowing for the flexibility and appreciating the skill of conjugating verbs in particular ways, even if they're different, is reflecting what Will said. I think the future global English will involve adaptation. So like we have today, we have many words for similar things. We will have many options for the creation of words, because that's what people do now. That's what people have done for a long time, to be honest. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting area, and yeah, it opened up a lot of debate, and I think everyone is right in lots of different ways, and our role really is to facilitate reflection as well as develop skills in this area. So yeah, I think this is a really important question, but I won't talk about it for too long because I'm sure you have lots of questions. So I'll hand over to Mariko. Thank you, Nick, for that question.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm just wondering, before moving on to answering the question, because Rob mentioned youngness and youth, and that just reminded me of what I said probably 5 minutes ago when I was talking about, I said something like easiness or difficulty of learning a foreign language depends on somebody's first language, and I was actually thinking, should it be ease or difficulty or easiness or difficulty of a foreign language learning depends on first language. So I'm just wondering, is it wrong according to the standard forms of English? I'm just wondering what Rob and Will would say. I really don't know. I just didn't know whether the word easiness exists or not. But for me, easiness fits better than ease. So that's why I said it. I just don't know what you were thinking about that. Sorry, I'm kind of digressing a little bit.
My response would be that you're asking the wrong people.
Yes,
of course we will accept it, right?
Yeah, as researchers of English as a lingua franca,
yeah.
I think we're unlikely to censor that use of language.
But that's something, you know, what you just raised as an example was just happening to me, so I just found it very interesting. So thank you for that. And so moving on to the question I was going to handle is, and by the way, thank you very much for responding to the question, is the spread of English a good thing? It seems like lots of people are very positive about this global phenomenon. And it's true, you know, people can communicate with each other using this language. In fact, I can communicate with people, so many people. This course has more than 50,000 participants, and I can't really do that with my mother tongue, which is Japanese. So yes, it's kind of enables us to communicate with each other, which is very positive. But it's interesting when the Baranowska mentioned, but there seems to be lots of people who just live happily in their own country without using English at all. But at the same time, people seem to be some kind of forced to learn the English language because it's seen as an important. And I thought this is kind of some kind of point which we shouldn't really overlook, because I think it has become a little bit problematic now. So for example, in quite many countries, when people apply for a job, they need to submit something like TOEFL scores and TOEIC score. TOEIC is probably a very popular test, especially in East Asian contexts. So they have to submit the scores of these English tests, even if they don't need any English skills at all for the job. And there has also been kind of discussion, especially in Japan, about introducing TOEFL test as a kind of university entry requirement, as one of university entry requirements, and also as one of the requirements for graduation as well, whatever your subjects are. So in that case, students need to pass exams, assignments, and dissertation in their own area, and also they need to get a certain score in TOEFL score. Not TOEFL score, sorry, TOEFL test. And these are some kind of examples we probably need to consider. Are they kind of justifiable because English is important? Or are they kind of examples in which English actually kind of gets in the way, or kind of stopping people from doing something else they want to do? For example, university students might want to focus more on their subjects, but at the same time they have to learn English because they have to graduate from the university. And lots of universities in East Asia probably have already started using this requirement, TOEFL score, as one of the requirements for graduation. So that's something we probably want to think about. Is it kind of something justifiable, or has it just gone too far? Is English seen just too important? So that's it from me. So maybe if you would like to add anything, Will?
Okay, thank you for that, Mariko. We have some live questions coming in, and one of them actually relates very closely to what Mariko was just talking about. So I'll read out the question. We've been asked, are IELTS and TOEIC, for example, taking ELF research into account, do we think? So I would have to say, I mean, first of all, I'm not an expert on testing, but certainly my understanding of what's happening is no. would be a very clear answer to that. I mean, if we look back at the debate between Jennifer Jenkins and one of the Cambridge examiners back in 2006, the idea of variation and variability then was different forms of Anglophone English. So this was for IELTS, I think, more than anything else. But by international, they meant the UK, the US, and Australia. They didn't mean global uses of English. They didn't mean world Englishes, varieties, and things like that. Now, I don't know if it's changed like that since then, but certainly my experience of talking to students about it and what I've seen in the testing would suggest that it hasn't changed. But I don't know if Rob or Mariko, you'd like to add something to that, or if you have more recent experience of it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to just mention, I think you're right. So taking account of English as a lingua franca, I'd say, no, probably the trend is moving in another direction. But there is, to be fair to these language tests, they have changed a little bit. And they did actually focus more on success. So in the IELTS criteria, there are clear references to native speakers. As I said before, you are allowed to make native speaker mistakes. You are not allowed to make non-native speaker mistakes. So things like that are clearly problematic. And it has a habit, you make a lot of mistakes, that's going to affect your score. And so we're really judging language not on performance, but on how many mistakes you make, not even on the kind of mistakes. So was that a functional mistake? Did it affect the meaning? Was it an advanced level mistake? No, there's no consideration of this. But to be fair to them, I would say there is an element where they did change historically and say, okay, they used words like appropriate and so linked well, for example. So it did move slightly away from a model that only tests English as a product. And some of their descriptors do test the performance of English. But the training and the guidance is really Anglophone-centric. So it's essentially based on the idea, if a Scottish person says, I have went to let's say, to London before, that's okay because you're Scottish. Probably if a Chinese person said that, they'd get marked down for bad grammar. So I think it has these elements that are problematic within the test itself. And I'd also say that, yeah, sorry, some of the scales, the criticism from people who value communicative competence, the real problem from their perspective is that essentially what people are measured against, so even the Common European Framework of Reference, is essentially, it's designed from people's perception. So the test makers design these criteria and they say what makes a successful communicator. It's not based on empirical research. And I was at a conference, oops, sorry.
No, sorry, that's my
your phone. Okay. So the problem at the end of the day is that what we're measuring people against is not based on empirical research of what makes a good writer, what makes an effective message, and is rather based on people's intuition that says, yes, I think this is native-like, this is learner-like, and this is incompetent. And what description of language shows is that it doesn't really work like that. So some people who are highly competent will make grammar errors that are not perceived in the communication situation. So no, I'd say, yeah, it hasn't really moved in a global English-friendly direction. I would say that certainly. So. Anything to add, Mariko?
Yes, so what ELF research or ELF researchers have found is basically how dynamic language use is, how variable it is, how flexible, how fluid it is. And that those kind of fluidity or flexibility probably don't go very well with the nature of the test anyway, because it's kind of the purpose of the test is to probably judge people's language ability against some criteria, or even measure people's language ability against some criteria. And one thing what I would say is what shouldn't really happen is ELF, it's some kind of seen as a variety of English, and against that variety people's language ability is tested. It's not something we don't want, we kind of want to happen. It's not something what ELF researchers are saying by saying that the ELF perspective needs to be incorporated in testing as well. But I think certainly, I don't know, I kind of wanted to ask Rob about this because he was an IELTS examiner. And I don't know, I was just wondering whether, for example, examiners with tests have an awareness in relation to this kind of flexibility of language, or they have some kind of course about, for example, English as lingua franca, or what the English is. Could it change some kind of testing system? Because examiners play a very important role. And I know that Rob was an IELTS examiner, but at the same time, he was an expert in ELF research as well. So I don't know whether it affected you as an examiner, or whether you shouldn't be affected by your knowledge about ELF. And what would you say about that?
A good question, but a horrible question.
Yes, maybe problematic as well.
I think, it's good because, like lots of people who are commenting on the MOOC that we have, or that you've created, I didn't create it at all. I took some credit there where it shouldn't be given. But yeah, I was kind of like this. My hands are tied. Of course, you don't get training in how English is used. Really, I was trained by IELTS to put away a lot of my knowledge of how language works and to focus on how they expect institutionally language will be treated. So the idea is, for example, I mean, I had the problem, I came from Taiwan, I'd been teaching in Taiwan, and yeah, I found that we watched a video and they told me, okay, this is an example of a 5, so a level 5 speaker, and I was shocked. You know, my mouth was open. I was like, what? I could understand everything she said because of my previous experience. I thought she was quite a good communicator, and we got into this discussion. But in the end, you learn how to put aside your understanding of what people are saying and how to discriminate against what they do. So no, it is quite problematic, and I think there is a huge potential. You know, they could really improve the awareness of examiners, maybe even to the point where we could question, as some people did, question whether a monolingual person who's never left their country should be allowed to have a high stakes testing position, or to be able to teach people who are in a dynamic communicative environment, because maybe that's beyond their experience. And I think there is a requirement for somebody testing conversational ability. I think there's a duty for IELTS to make their criteria less native speaker centric, because it's very old fashioned now. And also I think there's a requirement to raise examiners' awareness, because they have such a powerful role. You know, telling people whether they can get a visa to study abroad or not, can you enter university or not, is based on almost excluding knowledge of language. So yeah, but good question. But yeah, I had to discriminate, Mariko, is the answer.
Okay, thank you, Rob. That's very helpful. Okay, I think moving on from testing, we'll go to some of the other questions we've had. One question that's come up a few times is about the ownership of English. So who owns English? For example, Gemma asks whether it's the native speakers who own English, or whether we could define, or how we define ownership, or if we define it as anyone who uses the language. And Blake, for example, also argues that anyone who uses a language can claim ownership of the language. So Mariko, I don't know if you wanted to comment on those questions.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yes, I've just seen comments, and lots of people seem to have different views about this. Lots of people say native speakers own English because they are the people who produce the standard. So in terms of the production of the standard, they own the English, and lots of people also said, and yes, everybody who uses this language owns it. And thank you very much for actually pointing out the concept, the possible problem with this concept of ownership of English. Can we actually own a language? And lots of people, it's good that lots of people say that we use language, we speak language, but we don't own it. And it's a very interesting question, which probably opens up a door to this an idea or discussion of the concept of language or conceptualization of language. Can we conceptualize language as something kind of it's kind of a demarcated entity which we can kind of, in a sense, own? And then I think to answer that question, can we own English? I would say it is a metaphor. I think ownership of English, do we own English or not, is a kind of, I would say this is a metaphor which enables us to think about kind of standards, correctness, and whether or what we approach this, how we approach this global language. So I think it is a useful metaphor. So, and then to that extent, we shouldn't really discard this idea or metaphor of the ownership of English. But yes, it is a good question. Can we own a language? And then I think it's a very good point that there might be a problem with this concept or metaphor of the ownership of English.
Okay, thank you, Mariko. I don't know, Rob, if you wanted to add anything to that, or if you want me to go on to the next questions.
I'll just add, yes, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think one point that was raised on the MOOC is this idea that because English is a global language, native speakers don't own it. And like Mariko said, I would take it one layer lower and say, when I speak Chinese, I don't think that Chinese people own my language. You know, I have my ability in my mind. You know, I have my repertoire. I try to use it with other people. I don't see the concept of ownership as useful. You know, if somebody says to me, "Oh, you're speaking something I own," I think, no, that just sounds weird. but yeah, I agree with Mariko, and you can ask your next question, Will. So.
Okay, thank you. So I think the next question I'm going to go on to actually is the idea of native speakerness has come up quite a few times in questions, I think. And an interesting live question we've just had is people have asked, will ELF have an influence on native speaker English? Now I think that's an interesting question because I think it brings up, one thing it brings up is what do we mean by native speaker English? Mm. And I think clearly the use of English as a global language will of course affect how those people who are classified as native speakers use language. I mean, how could it not? We're all exposed to different uses of English through lots of popular media, whether it be YouTube clips, watching movies at the cinema, watching films at the cinema. Yep, so we are of course going to be affected by different uses of language. But it also, I think, brings up the question of what we mean by native speaker, because I think sometimes there's a confusion between a model of standard English, which in itself is problematic, but that becomes even more problematic when we assume that native speaker English is necessarily standard English. I mean, many people who would self-identify as native speakers of English do not speak what is often called standard English. And I mean, I would certainly identify myself as a native speaker of British English or of perhaps Southern English. But I certainly don't always speak a standard English. It depends on the context, who I'm with, what I'm doing. And I think that would be true for any speaker of a language. So I think, yes, most certainly ELF will influence native speakers, just as native speakers will be influenced by any use of language that they're exposed to, I think. Okay, I don't know whether Mariko or Rob, you wanted to add anything to that?
I can, yeah, I'm happy to. I'd just say something I said in the comment area was what you're saying. You know, sometimes people have a misconception. So they say, as you say, there's native speaker English which is stable, and ELF which has these new forms. But I pointed out when we looked at the examples on MOOC, almost all of those grammar patterns exist in native speaker English as well. If you go to the Fens, you know, the Norfolk area, you see third person S omitted. When you listen to Bob Marley, or if anyone likes the blues or jazz from New Orleans, you will hear native speakers using all the features that you can see in English as a lingua franca. And the reason is because what happened is people came to Britain. I mean, look at American English. You see some of the complexity that was in British English changing because America, when it began, was a multilingual environment. You had, lots of people from Ireland, from Scandinavia, from, all over the world coming together. And these patterns that are observed, that we emphasize in lingua franca communication, are logical patterns, but they also exist in native speaker English. It's not simplified. They don't simplify it and then learn a better version. Bob Marley wasn't singing and then suddenly he realized, now I've lived in America for a long time, I can use this language better. That was how he spoke, and that's, there are lots of very famous and renowned cultural center or people who are involved in cultural texts that are very influential. And yet, as English spreads, of course, exposure to these forms, exposure to global Englishes will change the language everywhere. Not to say everyone will speak a certain way. The same variety will exist. So I agree with you, Will. Yeah. I don't know, Mariko, if you want to add anything.
Yes. Yes. The thing is, I think it is kind of influencing very naturally native speakers English. For example, in this live discussion, neither Will nor Rob probably used any British idioms, for example, being aware that their audience is so international. So, you are using English as a lingua franca now. With the rest, not the rest of the world, with the audience of MOOC. So in a sense, according to the context, of course, it is kind of their interlocutors influence native speakers English. And I'm also aware that you two's experience, for example, Will has lived in Thailand before and Rob has lived in Taiwan before. So I think experiences probably play a very crucial kind of role in terms of the kind of native speakers English. So probably maybe some people who have never been abroad, who have never used English with non-native speakers might not be influenced so much by that fact because of the lack of experience, basically. So, and I don't think, for example, British idioms or any kind of local idioms of any kind of localness will disappear because of ELF, because it's an important kind of element for language to build solidarity, kind of the closeness among people who share the certain similar repertoire. So yes, it is influencing, but at the same time, it doesn't really kind of sweep away all kind of an L1 varieties for English, of course.
Okay, thank you, Mariko. Going on to the next question, I thought this was a very nice question. We have a question from Alina, I think it is, apologies if I mispronounced your name. She asked, why do people get so upset about ELF research? Which is a very good question, because people do get very upset about it. It's caused a huge amount of controversy since sort of the early 2000s when research on English as a lingua franca began to be published. And I think there are various reasons for this, and I'm certainly not going to go through all of them. But one reason I think that's been documented quite a lot in the writings about English as a lingua franca is misconceptions. So I think one of the major misconceptions people often have is that ELF is being portrayed as some kind of variety of English, and that this positive variety should be taught to everybody and should replace the other models of English. It should be a model that's used in all the exams. So it's as if these ELF researchers have come up with a new kind of English and now they're telling everybody else that that's what they must teach, that's what they must speak, that's what they must test for. Now, of course, that is a misinterpretation. That's not what anyone has ever claimed, or certainly nobody that would be considered a mainstream researcher in English as a lingua franca research. As everybody's been saying, and as you've probably realised from the materials this week, ELF is not a variety of English, and what follows from that is that ELF researchers are not recommending a particular model of English or a particular kind of English that should be used or taught or tested by everybody. I mean, as we've heard many times today, variability, fluidity, adaptation are all key parts of English as a lingua franca research. So certainly for me, I think one of the reasons people get so upset is often misconceptions. They're not clear about what ELF is or isn't, and they perhaps read things into it that aren't there in the actual research. So I don't know, Mariko, if you'd like to comment on why you think people get upset about ELF research.
I think it depends on who is upset by that, and then in what way upsets. But I don't know. I think some students would say, some people say like, if you can just make mistakes, and the students say no, 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 no. I just want perfect standard English. So just don't make me bothered by those kind of ideas. If that is kind of one of the upsetting feelings, I don't know. It might be something to do with the status of in a sense, like being able to speak native-like English as a non-native speaker. I think lots of students or learners of English want to kind of achieve that status. Simply speaking, they want to sound like native English speakers, for example, because they are aware of this kind of symbolic sign of that. If I speak English like a native speaker, I can just show to the rest of, to my communicators, for example, that I am very smart, so I am very competent or professional, anything like that. So I think there is some kind of an symbolic status with the native-like English. And that's something they just, or some people really just try to get it. And then when they try to get it, there's somebody who's saying that you don't need to do that. You shouldn't really make that effort. Then they could be upset about that, and so that's one of the reasons. I think it's the upset is a huge word, and then people who could get upset by that are various. So I'm just kind of I was talking about it from a learner's perspective, and that's something I can add.
I maybe add to that just very quickly the researcher's perspective, and I think in our article that we wrote together, we said English as a lingua franca is really, we're not saying this is something new that's happening. This is a situation. English as a lingua franca is like a research lens. So we're looking at something. We're choosing who we're looking at. We're choosing how we're looking at them. And really, it opens questions. We're asking open questions. What happens in these communication situations? What are the communication situations? And we're trying to explain this, which again is open. People don't realize that this is quite open to psycholinguistics. It's quite open to sociolinguistics, to study of identity. And sometimes people think that ELF researchers are trying to create something incredible and new and everything else goes. But actually, that's not true at all. Anybody can engage in the explanations of what we're seeing, and educationalists can engage with how we respond to this. So certainly we're not claiming to be the lords and experts of everything in the world. Okay, so
okay, thank you, Rob. Okay, well, I think our time is running out, so I'm just going to pass back to Marika quickly. I think I was going to summarise some of the discussions this week. Is that correct, Marika?
Yes, but probably we don't really have a lot of time. So I'm just going to mention the key point. Is that so the comments are still kind of open, and we have got lots of interesting discussion about the future of English, and then also the people's views about non-native teachers, non-native speaker teachers, or native speaker teachers. So comment fields are still open, so please kind of join the discussion. And also there are two polls. So on 4.8. Which is what is your attitude to English, and 4.14, which is what I can't really read my handwriting. What do you think is the future of English? So the results will be issued tomorrow, so Saturday tomorrow. So please vote as soon as possible. So that's from me, if that's okay.
Okay, all right. Well, first of all, thank you to Mariko and to Rob for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who's joined us live for this discussion. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Also, for everyone who's going to be listening or watching it later, thank you for everyone who's joined the course. This, of course, will be the last part of the course, so you've got to the end of your 4 weeks. I hope everyone's found it useful. And if you'd like to know more about studying languages and language education and language teaching, there are there's lots more information on FutureLearn. And as Mariko said, some of the discussion forums are still open, the polls are still open. So please keep coming with your comments. We are reading them. We are finding them very useful and very interesting. So I guess that's the end of our time for today. So thank you very much, everybody. And,
thank you.
Okay, and good luck with your future studies.
Yes.
Thank you.
or lack of.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.